Hello, everyone. Welcome to the monthly Move Smartly Roundtable. We are back for September with John Pasalis in Toronto. Hi, John.
Hello.
John's head of Velocity Realty and housing analyst. He's a broker as well there. And Steve Saretsky out in Vancouver. Steve is with Open Realty, a broker and analyst out there.
Always good to be back. It's been a while.
Yes.
This is John and I were talking about it, but I feel like this is kind of like a pivotal time for Canadian housing. And entering into the fall market, I think you're gonna get your usual uptick in inventory, and I think we're gonna find out if the demand is there to meet it.
Yeah, I agree.
So before we let go of the summer vibes, I have to ask, teacher style, what did you guys do on your summer vacations?
I went to Portugal for 2.5 weeks. I took the last couple of weeks of August off.
You did something else while you were there.
Sunbathing.
Housing related.
Yeah, I was working. I was working on my thesis, which I've been procrastinating and shipped while I was there. So I was writing most of the time, but it was a nice change of environment for sure.
John's too shy to mention that he's a doctoral candidate at University of Toronto Rotman and University of Reading in the UK in housing economics.
I mean, it's a business degree, but my research is in housing, Toronto housing specifically. Surprise, surprise.
Right. So you don't understand the point of summer vacation, clearly.
No, clearly not.
Got it.
Not.
But you were in Portugal, so it was beautiful. And Steve, I think you just came back from vacay?
I mean, I can't top that. And I've just been bouncing around mostly locally, obviously in BC and Vancouver here. It's the only time of the year that it's absolutely stunning. So you don't really want to leave. So just kind of bounced around BC most of the summer and tried to keep my foot on the gas pedal here because you never know when the market is going to slow further.
So you also don't quite gas pedal. That's not summer. But I agree with you totally, Steve. Toronto is so beautiful in the summer. So I've been doing a lot around here and really appreciating, the city for all of the housing woes that we continually discuss. It's still such a beautiful country with such beautiful people and places. So at least that did allow us to think about that. Yeah. All right. Now we're going to go to the dark side. No, just joking. First, let's start on what is happening in your local markets in Toronto and Vancouver. I'm curious to know what you're seeing now and what you think the fall market's going to look like. Who'd like to start?
John, take it away.
John.
So the market in Toronto, I mean, we've kind of touched on this the past maybe 2-3 episodes, has been slowing in the GTA. Sales are cooling down. Listings are kind of performing better than they were, 4 or 5 months ago. And what we're seeing is inventory start to increase. I mean, I think maybe 4 months ago, we had like just over a month of inventory in the GTA for low-rise houses. And now we're about 3 months for houses and 3.5 months for condos. So this is a sign of a market basically that is kind of hitting the brakes, slowing down. In terms of prices, basically what has happened is we're kind of at a level that we were last fall. So, in 2022, prices peaked maybe in February of 2022, then they fell. And then from this last summer till like the end of 2022, they kind of flatlined. And then we saw this run up in prices during the start of 2023. Which we've talked about on our show as buyers rush back in. But since then, average prices have declined. And definitely when we're looking at comparables, prices have softened a bit. So the gains that we made kind of in the first half of this year, we lost some of that. So we're kind of back to last year's level. And I mean, I think as Steve mentioned, as we move into the fall market, I agree with Steve. Like this is going to be kind of one of the more important falls. I mean, fall is usually not a kind of critical period. I mean, it's, sales pick up. It's kind of the two peak seasons are sort of spring and fall. But this year, more than any season in the past, is going to be quite critical because we're seeing the stress in the economy and the housing market that higher rates are having. And as Steve said, we're probably going to continue to see more listings as we move in. I mean, we were talking before we jumped on the show that, we're getting, and I'm seeing more calls from, kind of distressed households, not the kind who are going to foreclose tomorrow, but ones who have a lot of properties, a lot of debt, maybe took on a little bit more than they should have, and are just trying to unload stuff, to get rid of debt, to get rid of payments, and they still have equity in their property. So they're not kind of underwater and distressed in that sense, but they want to unload. So, and I think as we move into the rest of the fall market, we're going to start to see more of that. Now, the question, of course, is going to be, is that going to be so much inventory that it kind of overwhelms demand, which leads inventory to increase and prices to dip a little bit? Or are inventory levels and demand going to kind of be in line and in check? And obviously we don't know that. It's still kind of early, but I think that's, one of the reasons why the fall market's going to be pretty important.
And to that, John, can I just throw up a chart here that we've seen from our friend of show, Ben Rabidou, a great follow on Twitter. This is from his Edge Analytics report, and he's showing some interesting figures for Toronto. So just showing that Toronto is seeing a significant and counter-seasonal increase in inventory right now, heavily skewed to 416 condos and 905 single family. So that translates to downtown condos in Toronto and suburban single family homes. Now he's showing a change in active listings here in Toronto, May to August, not seasonally adjusted. And you can see the last spike, it's about 30% of right now. And the last spike we saw was back in 2020. So can you talk through what Ben is showing us here?
Yeah. So basically what Ben is saying, he said, okay, let's look at the number of active listings we typically see on the market in May, right? And compare that to August in each year, right? And what he's basically saying is that every year, basically back to 2007, the number of active listings on the market actually declines as we go from May to August. So there are fewer homes and condos on the market for sale, except for two periods. The first one was in 2020, and that was because of COVID. And then the second period that actually saw an increase is this year, where the number of active listings between May and August has actually increased. And that's, kind of consistent with the trends that we've been talking about. Months of inventory increasing, active listings increasing as we're moving into the fall market, which is contributing to the market slowing down. So he's right. Yeah.
The question is now, will the demand get, come to a standstill like we saw for a bit of COVID? Or exactly. Do you imagine? But then we remember after the initial standstill, actually people jumped right back into the market.
Yeah, I mean
the difference now. Sorry, interest rates
is 6+ % mortgage interest rates, right? And that's impacting who can even afford to buy a home. Yep. And that's and certainly there are going to be buyers out there, but how many, and is it going to be enough?
And Steve, the same question to you out in Vancouver. What are you seeing now, and what are you thinking about for the fall market? Is it a similar story? I know actually you did start out saying the same.
Yeah, pretty similar. I think these markets tend to move somewhat in tandem. I don't know if it's as soft as the GTA, but if you look at sales, you look at new listings, nothing exciting to write home about. There's no 20-year lows in any category, but both below like long-term 10-year averages, so kind of middle of the range. So slow on the sales side, slow on the listing side. Months of inventory is slowly starting to creep up. So you're seeing a bit of downwards pressure on pricing. I mean, that's also fairly typical for summer months. So it's much too soon to draw like drastic conclusions. But I think the reality is like John's point, right? I mean, 6% mortgage rates, the higher that we stay at those levels, the more downwards pressure I think we're going to have on prices over time. And so the next real test for the housing market, I think, is again in the fall as we get more listings coming to market. That's gonna put inventory on the market, and is the demand there to meet it? I think we saw in the summer, we certainly saw quite a few buyers that were pulling the trigger because they knew they had mortgage rate holds that were expiring. 3-year fixed rate at 4.99, not bad in today's context when you're looking at 6.2, 6.3, 6.4. And so people were saying, you know what, like, I want to move. I made the decision to move. I got to do it. I'm going to try to do it in this timeline. And so again, I think that was a little bit of a support for the market. And so it'll be interesting to sort of see as these rate holds, expire and people are now at 6+. And as we get more listings coming to market, I don't think it's a great setup for home values. But there's things, things can be unpredictable at times.
All right. So on the subject of rates, we just saw the Bank of Canada hold on its policy rate at 5%, while the bank governor, Tiff Macklem, indicated that future hikes may be warranted. Also of note, when Macklem was speaking at the Calgary Chamber of Commerce right after the bank announcement, he spoke about mortgage interest costs now being the largest contributor to the CPI inflation, consumer price inflation index, saying the single price increase that is having the biggest impact on CPI inflation is mortgage interest costs, which have gone up as we've increased interest rates. They're about 30% higher than they were a year ago. When you exclude mortgage interest costs, CPI inflation is close to 2.5%, which has led some to argue that inflation is effectively back at target. It's true that if we hadn't raised interest rates, mortgage costs might be lower today, but inflation throughout the economy would be a much bigger problem for everyone. I mean, I think if they hadn't raised rates, mortgage costs would be lower today. But I'm wondering what you think of the bank's latest move and Macklem's comments there, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I think, maybe personal vendetta, but I think that, I think they missed inflation on the upside, and I think they're going to miss on the downside. I just think it takes time. John and I were talking, before we recorded that, we're starting to see more and more stress. Again, think about people. We give this simple example, prior to the show, right? Which was, we're starting to see people, I think, John, conversations I've sort of had with people or in the background, and it's more been like, oh yeah, rates are up, but they'll probably go back down relatively soon. My mortgage isn't up for renewal another 12, 18 months. So I got time, I'm cash flow negative $500 a month, but I'll figure it out. And I think now we're kind of reaching the point where people are going, okay, maybe we're going to be stuck with, significantly higher for longer. And I need to start figuring out what to do. And so I think we're starting to see even people that maybe prudently bought a home 5 years ago, 2018 at 3% mortgage rate, you're now renewing at 6.2. If you take an example and say I borrowed $750,000 and you're renewing today at 6.2, you're going to see a monthly payment increase of $1,200 a month. So that's a lot for an average family of $1,200 after tax disposable income. Now, again, if you can requalify and push the amortization to 30 years to ease some of that pain, you get the monthly increase down to $900 a month. But I feel like there's nowhere to turn. I mean, $750K for Vancouver and Toronto I would say is a pretty modest mortgage. And so there's a lot of people out there with, $1 million mortgages and their incomes might be up a little bit, but so is their cost of living. So I think that, long story short, is I think Tiff Macklem, the Bank of Canada, I think are going to overdo it. So we'll see.
I think your skepticism is warranted. But we've had interest rate corner episodes, watch the old ones. But so interesting, John. I don't know if it's obviously the messaging from the bank has maybe injected a little bit of realism for those that are thinking, oh, this will go down. The messaging was, it was quite sharp around, we're watching this, rates might go up. Now, again, is that just messaging? But also structurally, if you're up for mortgage renewal, you're just up for renewal. There's also where you think the market's going, but then you're hitting this hard reality of having to go and now contend with these new rates. So are you thinking that a lot more household owners will have to confront that reality in the fall?
Yeah, no, 100%. Yeah. And some have been experiencing it. I mean, if you have a variable rate mortgage with Scotia, and I think National's the same, where the payments actually increase as the prime rate went up. I mean, you've been feeling this increase, right? And I think a lot of people have been just hoping things are going to get better. And you're right, we're kind of at the point now where, everyone's kind of realizing that, these rates are unbelievably high and probably going to stick around for a while, and just deciding what to do. And, as Steve mentioned, I mean, $1,200 a month increase on a household that's got a $750,000 mortgage, is a lot each month, and especially For some households that were already kind of maxed out and barely getting by, you know what I mean? To add on another $1,200 a month mortgage payment or additional mortgage payment is going to impact them. So, we're going to definitely start to see more people, even existing owners who might even just decide to sell because they cannot carry the weight of the debt, right? And downsize. I mean, I've been starting to hear anecdotal stories, none of our clients, but like friends of people who just actually considering downsizing their home to get debt off, and people who have like $1.9 million homes going to like a $1.3 or $1.4 million home. Again, I think, and I think we might start to see more of that as we move to, the fall and the beginning of next year.
But here's a question around that. Sorry, Steve, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I don't think it's a surprise that people took on more than they could chew during the depths of the pandemic when there was a housing frenzy and mortgage rates at 1.5%.
Yeah.
And a certain governor that said they would stay there forever.
Yeah, and your
nemesis.
Rates from 1.5 to almost 6.5. I don't think we have to like overcomplicate it. I just think that there's a lot of people caught offside because the move of interest rates and mortgage rates has been actually a record tightening, pace of movement, right? So and I think the notion that like, oh well, we're just getting back to more historical norms is kind of a stupid comment, because the reality is you have to adjust for the levels of debt and the levels of house prices, right? So effectively you've got a tripling of mortgage rates, more or less.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what matters, because you can talk about what the long-term historical rate is, but if you're not factoring in incomes and house prices, it's kind of irrelevant.
So I'm wondering a couple of things. So the groups that are most likely, if there is going to be this surge in listings, we're going to see households that came into the market, I guess, over the last few years and then experienced that interest rate, that sharp increase. And then those of them, that cohort that didn't see their interest rates kind of rise, but are now seeing the sticker shock of renewal. And I'm wondering what you guys are hearing about those who own more than one property. Is there, because I'm just thinking of Ben's chart showing the downtown condo listings and whether that's part of that story, where it just makes carrying these condos, even with high rents, the interest rate increases have been higher. So, are you seeing any of that kind of shift?
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing that. I actually just looking at this data now, I might write about it in a report where we can actually track kind of or estimate who's selling condos. I mean, if you look at every condo that has sold and you kind of look back in time and say, well, was the last listing for this place a rental or a sale? You can kind of figure out if it was rented by an investor or, potentially owner occupied, right? Because if the last listing was a rental listing, it tells you that it was, owned by investors renting it out. And what we're seeing when you look at the data is definitely a much bigger increase in the number of investors who have been selling condos over the past, say, 3-4 months, rather than end users. Like if you compare it to historical norms, I can't remember off the top of my head what the numbers are. Yeah, but it's the investors who are listing at a faster rate than end users.
Yeah. And where would end users go with these like crazy prices and interest? People are not upsizing, I'm guessing, a lot right now, right?
Exactly.
We're getting into the home of their dreams. Steve, are you seeing that, hearing from, one segment over another a little bit more frequently?
Yeah, definitely seeing that. It's just like, I think the biggest challenge, like even if you bought a unit, like I've had several of these conversations in the last couple of weeks, is even if you bought a unit like more at a more reasonable cost, and you rented it out like 5, 6, 7 years ago, you bought it much lower prices, but like your mortgage rate's gone up so much, and the reality is like in BC, I know on parts of Ontario like this, is like you can't really raise the rent. Like you can raise it 2% a year, even on new construction buildings, and so like you're not able to pass through those costs to the tenant. So you're almost like forced to sell. Like you either end up eating like a negative cash flow position, or like you basically have to sell or find a way to like more or less illegally kick the tenant out. And so I'm having a lot more of those conversations of like, hey, what do I do? And I'm like, well, listen, I mean, like this is, so we're seeing a lot of landlords going to the tenants and renegotiating and saying, listen, I know I'm only allowed to raise your rent 2%. That's the legal requirement, but I have two options. I'm losing, whatever it is, $500,000 a month. And so I'm either going to move into it legally and live in it for 6 months so I can get you out, or I'm going to put it on the market and sell. And in which case it's probably going to sell to an end user and you're going to get the boot. So what do you want to do? The government says I can raise it by $100. I need 500. And so we're actually seeing a lot of circumstances with the tenants going, yeah, you know what? That seems actually kind of fair, because even if you raise it $500, I'm actually probably still below quote unquote market rents.
Market rent.
So we're seeing a lot of those conversations happening. And then others, people that are just saying, you know what, just sell. And so I think that the pressure on the sell side, I think, is going to be more from the investors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the third option, of course, is, and we've seen this in Toronto for the buildings that are not covered by rent control. There was a headline, I think Two Sisters facing a really crazy rent increase. I don't know, John, if you remember it. It was like
$7,500 or something.
$7,500
like you just wanted to kick them out.
So, but again, I mean, it's interesting what Steve's talking about, negotiation. That's interesting. I'm not sure whether renters want to be helpful. They can. And again, the question will start to come around, what is the ceiling on the rents that people can pay?
Right? And I think you look at this dynamic that's playing out, which is like, you're seeing all these like landlords that are now like trapped. And like, I think some of them, like I said, I know there's like landlords have a bad reputation, but like, I think there's genuinely good landlords. Like I know, because I've had these conversations with like, I haven't raised my rent in like 4 years because the tenant's been so good, never have any issues. I didn't raise my rent for 4 years. Now my mortgage is up for renewal and I've got this massive payment increase, but the government's saying I can't raise my rent. I think it's pretty insane. And so they've actually basically the government has actually created like forced sellers. I look at it and say, well, man, like who wants to be a landlord in that environment? Like, and so that's why I think you're seeing the investor side on the demand side for purchasing is really weak right now. But also number two is, like people who buys pre-sale condos. Well, it's typically investors that plan to rent them out. And so, well, are they going to drive pre-sale purchases moving forward? That's a critical element to getting supply onto the market, whether you like it or not. That's typically how our system in Canada works. And so I think we're obviously seeing a huge drop off in housing starts. I think it's all correlated.
All correlate. Yeah. I mean, and just to add another perspective to this, I've heard landlords say, I'm stretched. I am held to this increase. I know that they have equity in their properties for 10, 15 years. Mm-hmm. So there's, I'm kind of wondering about the margins. Like, I feel like this is a margin problem. How many are actually in a position where their investment's not making as much as it used to? Mm-hmm. But they've got so much equity in it. It's, your portfolio is taking a hit, right?
For sure. So I suppose it's hard, for some people, it's obviously hard to sympathize, totally get it. So for a lot of investors, it's like, hey, listen, take your couple $100,000 profit and move on and exit. Obviously there's a lot of people that I think there's a lot of investors out there that get looped into they're all speculators. I think there are a lot of long-term buy and hold and rent into perpetuity investors, mm-hmm. and they're almost being forced out of the system, so to speak, because it's just not palpable. It is what it is. So again, it's not to cry for landlords. I'm just looking at it.
Yeah, no, for sure, Steve. It's just more conceptual for me. Is it fair to think about somebody who has a property portfolio that they've had equity in it for a long time as them taking a hit like you would in a stock market, rather than this other segment that's having a real problem even hanging on and will need to exit? Is that, because I think that's the one thing that's unclear. Like if you have a lot of equity in your properties, do you refinance under these circumstances? How do those investors stay in the game, right? Like, because we know not everyone bought in the last few years, right? In
but
Toronto?
I think it depends on the type of investor. If you're a conservative investor who bought a condo 10, 15 years ago or two, and that's all you have, then you're not going to have issues because you have tons of equity, right? The people who have issues are the ones who refinance that property and bought another, and then 4 years later refinance again, bought another. So each of their properties are actually maxed out on 80% loan to value based on the recent valuations, right? And if that's what you're doing, the numbers don't work for you. The second you have to renew, you're like going to be bleeding cash, right? So it depends on the investor. And there are some who are conservative who have not loaded up on 10 condos, right? But the ones who kept refinancing, maxing out on debt, I mean, they're definitely the ones who are going to be feeling the mortgage payment hit, because you cannot pay 6% on a mortgage with only 20% down when your cap rate's 3%, like you're bleeding cash. Like,
and to be fair, all end users, investors, everybody, they are just human beings acting in the market. I don't think we're all imbued with magical, demonic, or angelic qualities. The truth is, people have been faced with really rapidly changing circumstances, and so a lot of those calculations are now being challenged. So, and as Steve's saying, on that note, we're probably going to see the supply issue get even worse because the starts are down in the new build sector. So let me turn now a little bit to whether anyone is going to do anything about anything. So let's talk about the Liberal cabinet retreat. The federal government went on retreat earlier this summer, and it looks like the Liberal government came out with very little in terms of concrete announcements out of that retreat, and particularly on housing, really felt like a missed opportunity. Similarly, federal housing minister Sean Fraser has been less visible in the news lately, though we did see him suggest a few weeks earlier that Canada might want to think about capping international student visas. Lo and behold, there is something the federal government could have done. But interestingly enough, Quebec very quickly, and the Ontario Association of University and Colleges came back with strongly worded statements that they would not accept this kind of restriction or interference in the education sector. So who knows what will happen to that. So what do you make of the Liberals on housing? And it seems like, to me, just an opportunity completely lost. John?
Well, yeah, I mean, what can one say about the Liberals on housing? I mean, they obviously have not performed well, but I do think, the one of the big stories, you're right, that has come out is the impact international students are having. I mean, and it's quite interesting. I mean, for quite some time, at least on Twitter, I've been writing about this, and, my underlying point has always been, you cannot grow your population faster than your ability to build homes, or you're just going to kill housing costs, and in particular, lower income households more than anything, especially when it's students. And the challenge has been, when you make these arguments in Canada, you have all these housing advocates come out and say, well, that is just xenophobic. You're blaming the students, which is obviously a ridiculous comment. I mean, I would never blame the students. I mean, my parents were penniless immigrants. I'm never going to blame anyone who wants to move here for a better life. But the fact is, you have our provincial and federal governments driving up these international student visas without really caring where people are going to live. And now you have in North Bay students living in tents because there's no housing. And my feeling is this is like a political scandal. It does not smell right to me. International visas have gone from 200,000 per year to 900 in under a decade. These colleges are making billions of dollars. And it's really on the backs of these students who are paying these crazy fees, have nowhere to live. And it just doesn't seem right to me. And something just does it. Like, it's like the province and the federal government's more concerned about the profits that these colleges are making.
Without a doubt. Yeah. And for a bit of jurisdictional corner, John, I feel, and doing some of the reading, the government, they have definitely targeted, for example, temporary workers and upping lots of classes. But here it seems like the Canada rubber stamps a lot of the student visa applications that the colleges and universities are tending towards them. There's absolutely been a dereliction of duty. The quality of the kind of degrees, especially coming out of some of these private associations, institutions, are extremely suspect in Ontario. So a lot of them are coming, I'm not sure if it's the same in BC, Steve, but they're coming from, honestly, colleges you do not recognize. I have friends and family reaching out to my family going, oh, so-and-so's coming for this. And we're like, where is that? What is that? Will that get you anything? So it seems like a real, to me, I agree, it doesn't smell right. I really think this is a federal provincial issue where the financial stake of the provincial economies that are relying on this expansion of education is going to be one of the biggest, dare I say it, a Ponzi scheme, similar to the housing Ponzi scheme. Maybe Canada has too. Anyway, that's my little interruption corner. Steve, what do you make of Liberals and this international student, whether you expect to see anything happening?
Well, I guess it turns out we've been undercounting by 1 million people too.
Oh yeah, that's another.
Which is a small rounding error. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I've had conversations off air with people that run immigration firms. I've had economists from Ottawa email me that off the record that want to be talked about and mentioned. And I think everybody kind of knows it's a scam. It's people are being taken advantage of. It's money. I mean, Canada's known for having, monopolies, and I think that ultimately it's the government's kind of turning a blind eye to that. And obviously it's exacerbating a housing crisis, which we've known this for years, right? I mean, and I think Ben Rabideau, has probably been one of the most vocal people in this for years. John and I, we've been talking about it for a while as well, but I don't know, where was the media? It's only in the last 2 months, 3 months that suddenly all these news articles are being written, which has actually forced and prompted the government to actually come out vocally and publicly and to say something, because the media is finally putting pressure on them and their polling numbers are terrible. It's kind of a sad state of affairs, because I mean, I think that's part of independent journalism is to be digging into these things, and it's been a problem for a while, but we're only starting to see it now.
Oh yeah, I saw one stat, we'll get back to this in another episode, that Indian international students have funded the expansion of the provision of university and college spots in Ontario, outstripping contributions by the provincial government.
Yeah, that's crazy.
So amazing. Great. Nothing bad's going to happen with that. And it seems to me we kind of did what we did with foreign investors in condos. We'll just get all their money. They'll expand our housing supply. What could possibly go wrong, right? Yeah. And it seems like somewhere along the line, this started slipping into education sector. So I'm calling it something. I agree, something doesn't smell right, but it's just, it's jurisdictional. We got to get more comfortable with getting under the jurisdictional hood, because I feel like everybody is able to be like, it was him, it was him, it was her, it was that guy. It's a nonsense. It doesn't help that a lot of politicians end up sitting on the boards or becoming chancellors of these universities and colleges too.
Yeah, look at who the owners are in all of these colleges, what the relationships are with the provincial and federal governments. And listen, education is largely provincial, but the feds could have sort of put a limit on it if they saw it getting out of control. But the provinces are the ones that kind of drive the student visas.
No, the feds are loving it. They're just rubber stamping it all and seeing the contribution to GDP.
Yeah,
I think it comes full circle and just kind of shows you how complicated the housing crisis is here. There's so many facets that are going into it. Obviously, cheap and abundant credit over the years, a lack of underbuilding, an abuse of permanent residency and international students. Foreign money laundering over the years. It just, the list goes on and on. And it's just this isn't a problem that's getting resolved in 12 months. It's a pretty sad state of affairs.
Yeah. It's just the complexity gives room for a lot of people to do nothing and at the worst be on the take. But let's talk about someone else, Pierre Poilievre. Let's give credit. who maybe has done better on the housing in that same period. Federal PC government latest poll by Abacus showing overtaking the Liberals in popularity almost across the country. And most interestingly, amongst millennials. So even the Abacus's head, David Coletto, expressed shock that younger voters would be flocking to the PC party. That's not something you really see in such numbers. But Sabrina Matto writes a lot about housing of the National Post, noted that she has long said this was possible. So her tweet here, I did tell people this would happen a few years ago if conservatives capitalized on housing and gave voice to young Canadians. And yes, people did say I was nuts. So, numbers look pretty good. And I think, there is a shift here. Steve, are you feeling this shift in voter sentiment in Vancouver amongst those you hear from, willingness to go PC?
I just think that people are, as much like do our best to keep the politics out of it. But like, I just think people are tired. And this is not just, a thing of the Liberals. I think is in general, like, you're in power for, what is it? Was he 9 years now? Since 2015? Yeah, coming up. So I think just people get tired. I think the performance kind of speaks for itself. You look at real GDP per capita, it's gone nowhere for 7 years now. People, I think in general, if you ask people today, I think a lot of people are worse off. And so, cost of housing, cost of living, I think people are just looking for change. And, I'll give the Conservatives some credit. I think they've done a really good job on the social media and campaign file. I think they've hit a lot of the talking points that people are really concerned about. But I think ultimately, just in general, I think maybe people that would normally support the Liberal Party, I think they're tired.
Yeah. John, are you seeing more people willing to consider the PC party in Toronto? And specifically, is it housing that's driving them to maybe even consider a party they wouldn't?
Yeah, I think I agree with Steve. Even with, people who are traditional liberal voters, I think it's the same thing. It's like kind of getting tired of the party. And certainly if you are, whether you're renting or trying to buy a home, the record is not great. And I think, Pierre, his messaging has been stronger lately. I think he has the benefit of the fact that he hasn't been in office for 9 years, obviously. Like right now, I feel like it doesn't matter what the Liberals say. Like, part of it is like, it doesn't matter what they come out and say and they do, because it's only the record that matters, right? And yeah, that's obviously the challenge of being an incumbent. But the fact is, rents and house prices have exploded since 2015. So yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see this shift, and I'm starting to see it too. People are just tired. It's not that they would love to vote for the Conservatives, just like they're just kind of tired of the Liberals, is kind of what I'm starting to see too.
I don't think I've ever seen a time where housing is one of the issues that has maybe driven people to put aside other considerations, social and other considerations they might have when it comes to policy decisions. Political party decisions. I think that's a definition of a crisis, and I think it's finally hitting. And on that note, the federal NDP party seems to have been poked out of its slumber. Probably, seeing the Liberals' sliding numbers, their weird partnership with the federal government, probably not looking as exciting. And their leader, Jagmeet Singh, has suggested a number of policy proposals. I have a tweet here from our past guest, Dr. Mike Moffat. Delighted to see the NDP strongly advocating for two of our recommendations from the National Housing Accord, and that's things like taking GST off affordable rental construction and creating an acquisition fund like they have in BC for nonprofit and co-ops to purchase apartment buildings. Now, I'm just wondering, John, is this just too little too late for the NDP?
I feel like Jagmeet's been asleep for I don't know how many years. Like genuinely, like if you look at his comms, housing is such a huge issue, and he's largely said nothing for years until like literally the past month or so. He's kind of, like you said, woken up from his sleep and started talking about it. But I think no matter what he says, I think he's in a tough spot because of his partnership with the Liberals. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, this is kind of his government. He's partnered with them. They would not be in power without the NDP support. And I think like if you're an outside observer, it's hard to take that seriously because he's criticizing a government that he's actually backing. You know what I mean? So, and I think that's partly why the Conservatives probably gotten more of the millennial vote than the NDPs. I mean, even though the NDPs had nothing, but I think part of it is the fact that that this is kind of part of the NDP's government right now.
Steve, I know BC has had more
I mean,
NDP governments than we've actually been used to out here in the provincial levels. So.
Yeah, but like the BC NDP is more like, I'd consider them more like liberals. Like they're not like that far left, to be honest. And like the liberals that were in power in BC for, I don't know what it was, 16 years, I would argue they're actually more like the Conservative Party. So it's funny, like they're now all like changed. The BC Liberals here have actually just changed their name to I don't even know what they're called anymore.
Oh, everyone's changing their names and logos too, by the way.
Yeah, so everybody, I mean, you can see all like the political fractions that have happened. But everybody's been sort of mingling and housing for the last 7-8 years, trying to fix it and trying to make it a little bit better. New tax, new ban of some sort, all these regulations that have come out, and things just continue to get worse. And again, like even with house prices coming down, and I think they're probably going to come down further here over the next 12 months, I'm struggling to see how it's still going to be really unaffordable. And the rental market, John, I'm really curious moving forward is like the volatility in the rental market, I think is going to be really interesting. Because like you think about all these people that like, again, we talked about investors that are struggling with cash flows. Okay, well, they're going to sell. They're probably going to sell to an end user. That tenant's going to get kicked out. People that are just, I can't afford my renewal. I'm going to sell and go rent. Okay, there's more pressure in the rental market. Like we've still got really high immigration. So I think the rental market is interesting to see how well it's performing. If you actually look at the US, there's some good charts circling online, but the rents in the US in a lot of markets are actually declining year over year.
Really?
Canada, right? I mean, rents are still ripping, and I think it's just because all the things that we just talked about.
Well, all the non-permanent residences we're not counting, and the international students, which I wonder sometimes, will condo investors turn out to be a lobby for international student visas remaining at a high?
Probably.
Because, what's going to happen if you shift that calculus? Yeah. Right? Sure. Because in Toronto, wealthier students have been part of the rental story.
Yeah, but right? I don't even think I think the international student thing's not so much wealthy downtown Toronto students. It's actually
the renters.
For renters. I think it's actually smaller towns, these smaller colleges. Do you know what I mean? It's obviously there's going to be some international students at U of T and whatever, but I don't think that's the biggest narrative. I think
and those buyers would be buying anyway. Yeah. Those investors, even if their kid could go to U of T and they've bought a condo or a house, they probably would be looking to make the investment. So, but what you're saying is that in these other smaller towns, the international impact of students, Dr. Mike Moffat's written so well on this, is just it's crazy. Yeah. I wanted to whip through one more issue. Forgot what Steve was just mentioning. Steve, your last point there
on the rental volatility.
Yeah. It'll be interesting. You're right. If we see more investors sell downtown condos, obviously that's going to take inventory out, could put pressure on prices, resale prices down. If you see a lot of condo listings, it could kind of put pressure on rents up. So it is going to be an interesting next 3-4 months to see how that all plays out.
Weird anecdotal thing. I walk by a condo all the time in my neighborhood here in Leslieville in Toronto. I've noticed a much more publicly accessible sales office opening. And I'm not sure if this is like held back inventory. This building's like about to complete. But probably, it's funny that normally you would have seen that happen while you're trying to sell at a building. I wonder if fortune's changed. Maybe. And so anyway, we'll see. We'll see. Sorry, Steve.
Yeah, I'm just looking ahead here. Like, I think like one of the things, and we talked about like the politics and stuff of it, like looking at the polls, like I'm curious to see. I think without Tiff Macklem saying it very, very bluntly, like the Bank of Canada knows and wants and needs job losses. Obviously, that's not what the federal government or the provincial governments, for that matter, want. But curious, what's the voter sentiment, or what's public sentiment when we are officially in a recession and there are real job losses happening? Because I think we're not there yet. I think we're going there, with an overnight rate at 5% and mortgage rates at 6.2, 6.3. I think it's coming.
Yeah, I don't think you have to be a very courageous person to bet on a change at the federal level politically. And on that note, the NDP, I've always thought, John, the bet that Jagmeet and Steve, that Jagmeet Singh made was, oh, we're going to change from the inside by partnering with the Liberals. The millennials were up for them. If anyone's taken the millennials from someone, Pierre Poilievre has stolen them from Jagmeet Singh. The NDP are a social party. They could have come out with, let's tax third homes, like if you own more than 2 homes, anything that. But the problem is they seem to be in this world where they keep catering to baby boomers. And what a missed opportunity for them, I think.
Yeah.
Sure. Anyway, I think we've been chatting a lot. Steve, I have 2 quick hits, and they're both from Ontario and Toronto, and we're not being centric. It's just a lot happened here. We have a massive scandal in Ontario with the Greenbelt housing, which has actually resulted in the resignation of a housing minister here, Steve Clark. So, the quick notes on this: the Greenbelt is a protected area in the Greater Toronto Area. It's been protected for well over a decade, and building is restricted there. Recently, certain parcels of land were opened up, and the process so that the developers that own those lands would be able to go ahead and develop them without any Greenbelt restrictions. Greenbelt restrictions, obviously, as the name implies, they're to protect wetlands and all kinds of other ecosystems, so you can't build whatever you want on it. Now, a proposal came from the Doug Ford provincial Ontario government. Well, there was no proposal. I guess a secret proposal or a bat signal was sent out that maybe some parcels would be taken out of the Greenbelt. Now, you can imagine the value of that. The Auditor General of Ontario has pinned that $8 billion of land that has been worth of land that has been involved in this scandal. Basically, a very opaque process meant that, they're saying it was just the chief of staff of the housing minister, Steve Clark, that just kind of rubber stamped 14 of the 15 parcels based on some information packets he was getting. I'm told they were very thick.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what was in them.
I think it's a coincidence that many of them were probably, I think, Doug Ford's daughter's stag and doe. So
a scandal. He's finally resigned. The incoming housing minister then comes in last week and says, and I'm just wondering what you think of his proposals here. Let me get his name right. Paul Calandra. So he comes in and immediately says, okay, to be fair, we're going to review the entire Greenbelt and see if amongst all of it, what needs to be opened up. So, of course, this is, very interesting. They're going to impose a use it or lose it policy for developers.
Yeah, okay. Give me a
speculation penalties, increase in non-resident speculation tax, and put developers on notice.
Yeah, okay. This is all nonsense. This is just like tough talk to make it sound like they're very serious about housing. Use it or lose what? Anyways, this is the provincial government's a complete scandal. It's ridiculous that they opened it up. And obviously it's just done to profit Dougie Ford's friends that are developers. So anyhow, completely ridiculous.
Steve, have you followed this at all from Vancouver?
To be honest, not that closely. I'm familiar with it, but kind of out of my wheelhouse. It sounds like there's some backdoor games being played, which is, let's be honest, pretty typical for a lot of the big developers.
Right.
Not surprising.
You gotta know someone to grease the wheels, and that's
100%.
The reality is, I think, in business, and again, I'm not advocating for it, but it's always about who do you know, and I think money talks, and I think that private developers with a ton of money, you can buy political influence, and I think this is like case in point. I think it's a lot of the issues in Canada that we're seeing. We talked earlier about private colleges. Same dynamic.
Yeah.
And I like what you said. I also agree with your point that Canada is like a place of monopolies. Like we just don't question a lot. We have this I don't know if it's because we were a British colony, but like this order respect where we just respect, and we don't, we don't look under the hood of these things. So the only good thing about this is maybe in Ontario, we know this has been a big contentious thing for a long time. Maybe this is, woken some of us up. So we'll see what happens. Last quick hit in Toronto again, but wondering what you think as well, Steve. Is there a new tax on mansions coming? So a proposal going to Toronto Council to deal with the fact that the city of Toronto, it has a massive budget shortfall. It can never make ends meet, and the gaps increase more and more every year. So the thought is to increase taxes on so-called mansions. Other proposals are to introduce a municipal sales tax. So everything, it seems, but actually increasing Toronto property taxes, which are amongst the lowest, if not the lowest, in the Greater Toronto area. John, you tweeted that rather than raising in property taxes by an average of $25 per household, Olivia Chow, the mayor of Toronto, is introducing a mansion tax, an additional land transfer tax as high as 7.5% on homes above $3 million. So
completely
you've expressed
idiotic.
frustration.
It's so terrible. This is from the group who thinks let's just tax the rich. It's all great. Without realizing that this distorts housing markets, it makes it harder for someone, in a $1.5 or $1.8 million home to upsize, because there's now way more fees associated and taxes associated with it. Which is going to constrain the supply of more affordable housing. And what's terrible about it is like they're only going to make, say, 25 million, which is obviously a lot of money, but there's like a million houses, say in Toronto. You increase everyone's property tax by $25 is way better than distorting the housing market by taxing, mansions. And $3 million home is not a mansion in Toronto right now. When the average price of a detached home is not that far from that.
Again, Steve, sorry, we've been so Toronto-centric. In Vancouver, are there any taxation issues that are similar that you think of, or, what do you think in general of this idea of kind of making homeowners be the, take the brunt for bigger issues, probably?
Not at the city of Vancouver level. We did have a provincial government, again, the NDP government, which I'd argue is a little bit more of a liberal government, even though they're wearing the orange shirt. They did bring in like a luxury, they called it a school tax, but it really was a luxury tax. So they increased the property transfer tax on homes above 3 million. And then there was another increase. It basically scaled up, and so if you bought a home above 5 million, the tax was even greater.
So they did that.
And they called it a school tax. This is fascinating.
They call it like an increase, but then now, so they do have it also. They do have a school tax where, it's 0.025% increase. So it actually would be something similar. So that was an increased transfer tax. They also brought in what they call a school tax.
It's like a property tax, right?
Essentially, for homes that were above $3 million.
Interesting.
Which is funny. I don't know, like, it's really sad to say this, but like, if you own a $3 million house in Vancouver, like on the west side, it's not a very nice house. Like, I would argue a lot of people that have $3 million houses bought them for $500,000 20 years ago. So they're rich on paper, but they're not actually, like, I would say a lot of people aren't actually wealthy individuals.
That is really important observation.
Asset rich, income poor. So a lot of that, but I don't know. I think that's kind of where the politics are going, right? It's just wealth disparity. Governments are trying to point fingers.
What kind of world are we living in where a $3 million house is on the wrong side of town?
It's sad state of affairs.
Welcome to Canada.
That's the west side of Vancouver, which is kind of like the creme of the creme. It's the best real estate, I think, in Vancouver. But like $3 million is not buying you a nice house. A lot of them do tend to be occupied by 65-year-old, 70-year-old boomers that bought in 38 years ago, and are now in retirement.
And so
deferring their property taxes, I should say.
Say it again, Steve.
They're deferring their property taxes.
Yes.
Are they?
You've actually hit on the problem in Toronto. Why no one wants to touch the property taxes, because it's a lot of the same stuff here, right? Like you have a house that's worth a lot, that's you've been in for a long time.
So your annual, so you're if you're a senior in BC, you can defer your property taxes on an annual basis. And they charge you a 1% interest rate.
Oh my God, really?
Which is insane. So it's like it's a free subsidy at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So it discourages, older boomers, retirees to basically just downsize and live. It discourages them from downsizing. They may as well just like sort of age into their property. And so that's ultimately what's happened. And so these houses don't get redeveloped or densified because they get a freebie.
That's similar
That's
than
actually
here.
pretty wild. That's like the cheapest debt you're gonna get, 1%, eh?
Yeah, it's always been one, and they haven't changed it. So again, taxpayers have been subsidizing. I think it's an insane program.
It's the closest to not raising property tax play, which the politicians are so afraid of in Toronto, because you do have a lot of pockets with like really wealthy, like on paper, like you said, anywhere in Little Italy, the Annex, all these places, but there are a lot of them owned by people who scrimped and saved and got into those homes, right? And years later, they don't want to touch the property tax. So anyway, that is fascinating. Steve, I was going to give you the last word because we were so Toronto and Ontario centric, but you kind of blew our minds already.
I was going to say, Ron Butler summed it up. Ron Butler summed it up once, and he said, people say they don't like talking about housing, and he doesn't like talking about politics. And but he said the reality is housing is predominantly politics. So much of what we're in today is political decisions that we've made over the last 20 to 30 years. Whether that was under the old conservative government of, 0 down 40-year amortizations to, the new government that we have today and the Liberals and the provincial governments, it's all one and the same. So unfortunately, housing is political, and sometimes you have to go there.
Yeah.
We're going to keep going there. Boom.
Nice.
Nothing else to say. We'll see you guys next month. I thank you guys all for listening. Please keep your questions coming. You can reach John on, is it Twitter or X?
It's Twitter. It's Twitter.
Do you tweet or do you X now?
No one calls it X except Elon.
You can X John at John Pasalis on Twitter /X, at Steve Saretsky. I'm at Move Smartly as editor of Move Smartly. I thank everyone, and welcome back. School is in session, so we'll see you next month.